Well, we are ready for Acts chapter 20. Paul is concluding his ministry in Ephesus. And remember that he remained in Ephesus for 3 years, as we'll see when we get to the end of this chapter. And that's the longest of any of the stays recorded in the book of Acts in Paul's ministry. 3 years. And so much happened in that city. So let's continue on here and find out what happens as Paul makes his way to Macedonia. Notice he says, after the uproar had ceased, Paul called the disciples to himself and embraced them and departed to go to Macedonia. Now, one question we could ask here is, was Paul constrained to leave? Did the uproar in the theater there make it necessary for Paul to conclude his ministry there? Well, it may have, but remember that Paul had already sent Titus and Erastus ahead to let the Macedonians know that he was planning to go. And that was before the uproar. So regardless of what happened with the uproar, Paul was already intending to be on his way to Macedonia to revisit the believers there. And so he does. Now, he went over that region, and we'll look at a map in just a moment, but remember that the region there refers to the region of what would be northern Greece today, Macedonia being in the north and Achaia or Greece as it's called in the south. In fact, notice in verse 2 that Paul says after he had encouraged the Macedonians up north, he went to Greece. Just remember, and this sometimes is a little confusing, that Greece here is the same thing as Achaia. All right. So why is he called it Greece? Well, apparently it was known as both. Just like you can refer to our country as America or the United States. Greece was also Achaia, which would be the region below Macedonia. So I hope that's not too confusing. And by the way, while he was there is probably when he wrote the book of Romans. This is during those 3 months. And when you study Romans, you can see, by the way, that Paul greets the people in Rome, that he is writing from Corinth or Achaia or Greece. All right. So you can see they're right across the Aegean Sea from one another, almost directly west from Ephesus. You come to the city of Corinth. All right. Now, notice he stayed there 3 months. And again, Luke is not normally very precise about time, but here he is. And I think that's because he wants to point out the fact that Paul intended to sail back to Syria, and but he couldn't, or he decided not to, because there was a plot on his life by the Jews. Now, most likely, what Paul is intending to do here is to sail back to Israel. Remember that oftentimes he would go back to Jerusalem first, and then he would go down to visit the church in Antioch. And that is probably what's happening here. When he says he's intending to sail to Syria, he's referring to Antioch, the church that had sent him. But on the way, he would probably plan to stop in Jerusalem. And my guess is that he wants to stop there for the Passover. Remember, he likes to be there at big occasions so that he has an opportunity to announce the Lord Jesus Christ as the Messiah of his people at those big occasions. But the Jews are aware of his plans, and they're plotting against him, probably some sort of an ambush or something to kill him. And so he changes his plans and decides to go back again through Macedonia. Okay, and we'll look at a map here in just a moment and give you a little bit better idea of what's going on. And then Luke provides us with a unique list of names here of people that were accompanying Paul at this point. And notice their names. Sopater of Berea accompanied him to Asia, and Aristarchus and Secundus of the Thessalonians, Gaius of Derbe, Timothy, Tychicus, and Trophimus of Asia. Now, you'll recognize the name of Timothy here. The other names may not be as familiar to you. I do want you to focus on the name of Trophimus, that last one there, because when Paul does eventually arrive in Jerusalem, Trophimus is going to be part of the narrative there, and the tumult and the arrest of Paul and all that takes place in Jerusalem. So keep his name in mind. Now, notice that Luke says in verse 5, these men going ahead waited for us at Troas. Okay. Now, two things I want to point out here. First of all, the size of the the list of names in verse 4 should not lead us to assume that these are people that travel with him all the time. No. A lot of different people traveled with Paul at different times during his missionary journeys. The ones that were with him most all the time were, Barnabas in the first journey, and then Silas, Timothy, and Luke at the beginning of the second journey. So just keep in mind that Paul didn't always have that size of a group of people going with him. But at this particular phase, it appears that that these all are part of his team. So just keep that in mind. It's kind of like Jesus had 12 disciples that were with him all the time, but there were many disciples that traveled with him at different times and on different occasions during his earthly ministry. Now, these men, verse 5, went ahead and they waited for us at Troas. And the second thing I want to point out here is that Luke is rejoining the team. Okay, notice the us. The last time we saw the we or the us was back in chapter 16 when they arrived in Philippi. But when they left Philippi near the beginning of the second missionary journey, then Luke discontinued using the we and the us. It was they and them. But now he is back with them again. Now, notice that he says they waited for us at Troas, but where are they at the moment? Well, we'll see that in just a minute. Let me blow this picture up for you because I want you to see what's happening. The blue dots represent the locations from which these men who accompanied him on his journey were from. You can see that there's a variety of locations here, from all the way back from the first missionary journey there in Galatia, or modern day Turkey. You see the blue dot there at representing the area of Asia, and then up in the upper left corner you can see the Macedonian representation as well. So I just show you this to point out that Paul was accompanied by people from a variety of locations representing the places where he had ministered. Now, notice again those two red dots. Again, the dot on the right is Ephesus in Asia, and the red dot on the left is Greece, probably specifically Corinth, where Paul would have gone for those 3 months. Now, you notice that there's the Aegean Sea there. In order to get from one red dot to the other, you kind of have to go up and around. So just kind of think of a horseshoe, okay? So when Paul left Ephesus at the end of that tumult, he went up and around and down to Corinth. And his plan was to sail straight back from Corinth all the way to the right side of your screen to back to Syria ultimately, but probably to Jerusalem for an initial visit and to attend the feast at Passover. But because of the plot of the Jews on his life, he went back up around that horseshoe once again, and when he did, he came to Philippi, and I believe that Philippi is where Luke rejoined the team. Remember, every indication is that he remained at Philippi to minister during the time when Paul and his team moved on. So basically, Luke and Paul have been separated since the beginning of the second missionary journey, when he stayed at Philippi, to the end of the third missionary journey. And so we're looking at probably a period of around 7 or 8 years that they have not been together, which is a significant period of time. All right. So notice he says in verse 6, when we sailed away from Philippi, and there it is. So there it's clear that Paul rejoins, or Luke rejoins Paul when Paul arrives in Philippi. Okay. And just a heads up, Luke will remain now with the Apostle Paul right to the end of the book. In fact, even when Paul writes the last inspired letter of his life to Timothy, the second letter to Timothy in chapter 4, he will say, only Luke is with me. So we get the impression that Luke really never left Paul's side again from this point until the time of Paul's departure from this earth. So just something for you to keep in mind. Now notice that he says we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread. Now remember that unleavened bread is the same as the feast of Passover. I mean, technically they're two different feasts, but they're glued together. Passover is the one night feast, but then unleavened bread goes on for a longer period of time. But they are often referred to as synonymous because they are connected. That's why I think that Paul wanted to go back, straight back to Jerusalem to be there in time for the Passover or unleavened bread. But because of the plot of the Jews on his life, he ends up going back up around that horseshoe once again. And when he gets to Philippi, Luke rejoins them. So you see, God did not allow Paul to go back directly to Jerusalem because of the plot of the Jews. He redirected his steps, and in so doing, he actually brought about the reuniting of Paul and Luke as a missionary team. So, everything that God allows in our lives, even things that seem unfortunate or delays that come about, threats, whatever the case may be, God uses everything to bring about his ultimate plan and purpose. And that's a wonderful and comforting truth. So, notice that they left Philippi, and in 5 days, they joined the other brethren at Troas, where we stayed for 7 days. Okay? Now, Troas, remember, is the city where, when they were trying to figure out where God wanted them to go on the second journey, remember, they tried to go to Asia and the Spirit said no. They tried to go north to Bithynia, the Spirit said no. So they pushed on, and when they got to Troas, that's where they had the vision. Paul had the vision in the night of a man from Macedonia saying, "Come over to help us." That's the same Troas. And so now they're coming back there again, and they stayed a whole week there. Now, why they stayed a week, we're not told, but apparently there was a significant number of disciples there. Perhaps several churches had been formed there, and Paul stayed there a week. And notice he says, on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight. That's some interesting things happening here. First, notice it's the first day of the week, which would be our Sunday, okay? And remember that it's already been established as a custom that the church met the first day of the week. They probably met several times during the week, but the first day of the week became the hallmark meeting time for the church. And that probably because the Jewish Sabbath would be characteristic of Judaism, whereas the first day of the week became to characterize the meeting time for the church because it was the day that Jesus rose from the dead. And they were breaking bread, probably observing the Lord's Supper. We don't know how often the Lord's Supper was observed. Jesus simply said, as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you show the Lord's death until he come. And so, they may have done it every week. We don't know. But here they're doing it. And they're in an upper room somewhere. Okay. Somebody had a large area where they could meet. And he continues his message until midnight. So, future preachers, here's a proof text for you if you want to be a long-winded preacher. Well, not really. I'm just joking. But the fact is that this is Paul's last opportunity to minister to them. He just keeps going on and on and on. And here you kind of almost see a little bit of Luke's sense of humor coming through. There were many lamps in the upper room where they're meeting. It's nighttime, it's dark, and so they're probably burning kerosene lamps. And as you know, kerosene lamps and any kind of gas lamp consumes a lot of oxygen. And so when that happens, there's a lack of oxygen in the room, that gets you yawning. It's already late at night, and a lot of people are there consuming that oxygen. And a young man named Eutychus is sitting in the window. We have no idea how old he is or anything else about him, but he made the mistake of sitting in a windowsill. Remember, these would have been open windows, and they're on the third floor, as we see at the end of verse 9, and he's getting sleepy. And for some reason, nobody seems to pay attention to this or, to notice the impending danger here. And so he was overcome by sleep, and as Paul continued speaking, he fell down from the third story and was taken up dead. Okay? And when it says taken up dead, it doesn't say that he was assumed to be dead, as the case when Paul was stoned in Lystra. It says he was actually taken up dead. It's a confirmation that Eutychus died. Okay? So now, Luke is in no way criticizing Paul's preaching or the length of his message. He's simply stating a circumstantial thing here. But what I want you to notice is that God uses everything. I already said that. God used the plot of the Jews on Paul's life to redirect Paul's steps. And now he's using the falling out of a window of this young man and his death to bring about a greater miracle. And what is that miracle? Paul went down and fell on him and embraced him and said, "Do not trouble yourselves, his life is in him." It's kind of reminiscent of Elijah when Elijah laid his body across the dead boy, remember back in the Old Testament, and his life came back into him. It's very interesting. Paul didn't just touch him or just stand there and speak to him. He laid his body across his, and his life came back into him, which may be just a way of kind of reminiscing on the miracle of Elijah and maybe making some sort of an association with that. And so they came up, they broke bread, they ate. And notice Paul didn't even stop. He kept talking. Maybe this was more of a conversation at this point. I don't know. But they continue right on until daybreak. Nobody's tired anymore. A miracle has just taken place. I mean, they brought the young man in alive and they were not a little bit comforted. And the whole scenario changes. So, two unfortunate things: the plot of the Jews on Paul's life, and now the falling out of the window of young Eutychus uh, provide opportunities for God to do His work in His way. And it's just a beautiful reminder that our lives, our circumstances, our times, our direction are all in God's very capable hands.